Hey guys, it's Jane. I am here today to talk about a book I recently read. The book is Watch Over Me by Corbett. It's a recent release. Corbett is Canadian, I believe, by birth, but she currently lives in Australia. So this is an Australian publication. I picked it up at the library and it was nothing at all like what I expected, but it was a surprise of a good sort. There's a lot of food for thought in this story. It is sort of set in a near future kind of imaginary land. Well, imaginary is not the right word. Fictional land or city, which is under occupation. The rest of the world, basically outside of this city, is the world that we know, and there's lots of place names and things that are talked about outside of the city that are real and familiar. I think she's used a fictional city to kind of anonymise or to generalise some of the topics that she's talking about. The city is in the Arctic Circle, which is interesting to start with, and it is sort of in the location of some of the last untapped oil reserves, is I think what's going on, and therefore is a military target. And a few years before the beginning of this story, maybe 3 or 5 years, something like that, the city was occupied by external military forces. And the story is largely about that. It's largely about the dynamics of living in an occupied city, so living in a war zone. The central character is a young woman. She's 20 or so. She hadn't finished school at the time that the occupation began. So she finished it in the early days of the war. She was intending to go to university, but those options are no longer available to her. She has a very young brother who's, I think, about 5 at the time of the story. And he has not started school because basically there is no school for him to go to. Our heroine has stayed at home with her mother, trying to keep the family business afloat. They run a cafe on the docks, and she has a fairly limited existence. There's one girlfriend that she has from school days who comes from a wealthier family, and their connection is sort of failing. They don't have any sort of similar experiences day to day, and so yes, there's that, but largely her existence circles around this cafe and trying to just exist through the occupation. The action of the story comes by virtue of the fact that on a day that's seemingly like any other, she was stopped at a checkpoint, and one of the young soldiers who was manning the checkpoint took it upon himself to harass her and her brother, and things kind of got out of hand to the point that she was on her knees with a sack over her head and believed that she was just about to be killed when an officer intervened. It's an incident that means very little to him, but for her is kind of a central moment in her life. A few weeks later, he and some other fellow officers come into the cafe. She recognises him immediately. He has no idea who she is. And anyway, one thing leads to another, and a relationship springs up between these two young people, a woman of the city and a soldier of the occupation force. And there's all sorts of problems that arise from this. So the book is kind of a story of this doomed romance, and at one and the same time a sort of an analysis of what's going on in this scenario. Because of course she really, once this officer took a shine to her, like noticed her, she basically had no power to say no, and so very quickly she's his concubine, essentially. But that is not to say that she was unwilling, because actually he makes her feel safe. Then she has to live with the hatred that she gains from almost all sides then, as being a collaborator or somebody who's sold out. And yet, by virtue of this relationship that she is carrying on, almost certainly without her real consent, it does bring protection to her family. So, yeah, there's just all these really complicated ideas being worked out. The characterization is good. The writing is really clever. It's a really good read. There's lots of stuff in there about war that is very thought-provoking, but more than that, there's lots of really striking things that the book has to say about the relations between men and women. And there's just a couple of short quotes that I'm going to leave you with. I would love to talk with anybody in the comments to see what you think about these quotes from the book. The first excerpt that I'm going to read is a quotation from a blog post that Max, one of the characters in the story, a journalist who is a part of this occupied city, writes, reflecting on the experience of our heroine and her relationship with the officer. This is what war teaches us, as it raises every advance and returns us to the ground zero of power, where human rights for women are at best always on loan, temporary. And that, of course, is its purpose. Occupied Port reveals to us a most elemental human predicament. Women have only the human rights that men decide they can have. That last part, that women only have the rights that men decide they can have, I think, if anything, might be the thematic sentence for this book. It's actually repeated at least 3 times throughout the story. And that's something that I have really sat with since reading the book. In some ways it feels like it's a betrayal of our suffragette and whatever ancestors to assent to that saying, and yet I kind of feel that it's true at some level anyway. Yeah, I'll get on to the second quote. The second quote is a slightly longer passage, and this is a conversation that happens in the cafe. This is a perfect example of why women make poor judges of morality, Max said, delighted by the prospect of an argument. Oh God, said Mum, stop, you're just encouraging him. But it was Inga who couldn't resist. Talk to Gull about that. She'd agree with you. Max stared at Gull. To think that all this time I knew nothing about you. Max, said Gull, you don't know anything about anyone. You just like to hear yourself talk. But Max persisted. So why do you think that women are poor judges of morality? I refilled the sugar bowls, watching Gull, wondering how she could answer such a question. The mothers were watching Gull too. Gull set down her cup. I don't think they're poor judges, just that some considerations weigh heavier. Morality is contingent for women. Always they must consider the particular, the effects of a decision on the weakest, on their children. This seems morally sound, and often it is, but in practice it all too often means siding with whatever authority is in power at the time. They're right, like our young mothers over there, to do this. It's what they must do. We are all descended from such women, and if they'd been any different, we would not be here. Chaos and instability hurt the weak even more than oppression, Gull continued, and women are weak, as you've pointed out many times. Oh well, said Max, you know what my people say. Both scholars and fools speak freely. Gull held up her hand. I know you didn't mean that in a personal way. You meant our lack of political and military muscle. Weak in the sense of realpolitik. I get it. And so many of us cannot afford to take a stand on principle or on any abstract system of morality. There's a longer conversation here, but I'm going to leave it there. I hope I've intrigued at least one or two of you enough to go and pick up this book. I hope you're all well, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.